Humiliated in front of a crowd, she stood up, not just for herself but for everyone who's ever been made to feel small. The restaurant was alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faint melody of a piano in the corner. It was a Saturday night at Merriweather's, a charming spot tucked into the heart of San Diego, a favorite for date nights and special occasions. Every table was filled with couples leaning in close, groups laughing over shared plates, and servers expertly weaving through the sea of patrons. Among them, at a table near the window, sat Hannah and Greg. Hannah had spent the day looking forward to this dinner. She'd worn her favorite dark green dress, one that Greg had complimented the first time she'd worn it years ago. Greg, in his crisp white shirt, looked like he belonged in the polished atmosphere, but his expression carried a trace of irritation that Hannah couldn't quite place. They were celebrating their anniversary, 15 years of marriage. The milestone was one Hannah cherished, but as the evening progressed, the warmth she hoped for felt like it was slipping further away. Greg's focus was on his phone, his fingers scrolling absently, while Hannah filled the silence with stories about their kids and plans for the garden she wanted to start in the spring. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling in her chest, the one that whispered something wasn't quite right. She smiled as the waiter arrived with their entrees, setting a perfectly seared salmon in front of her and a juicy steak in front of Greg. The food smelled divine, and for a moment it seemed like the meal might bring a shift in the energy between them. But then Greg sighed, a loud, drawn-out sigh that cut through the background noise. "You forgot again, didn't you?" he said, setting his fork down with a clink. Hannah blinked, caught off guard. "Forgot what?" "The bill," Greg replied, his tone sharp. "I told you to take care of it before we got here." "You always forget, Hannah. It's like you don't listen." Her cheeks flushed as she quickly realized her mistake. She had indeed forgotten to prepay, as Greg had asked earlier that week. It had slipped her mind in the whirlwind of work and taking care of their 2 kids. "I'm sorry. I really am," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise around them. But Greg's voice wasn't soft. "You're always sorry," he snapped. "Do you even take anything seriously?" The people at the surrounding tables began to glance over, subtle at first, but increasingly curious. Hannah's face burned as she glanced down at her plate, hoping to shrink into the chair and make herself invisible. But Greg wasn't done. His words carried the weight of simmering frustration, and Hannah could feel the storm brewing just beneath his polished exterior. The tension between them thickened, spreading across the table like an uninvited guest. Hannah tried to salvage the evening, picking at her salmon and offering small conciliatory comments. But Greg's frustration was a tidal wave, growing larger with every passing second. "I don't get it," Greg muttered, cutting into his steak with more force than necessary. "How hard is it to remember something so simple? I reminded you twice." "Twice, Hannah." His voice was loud enough now that a few heads turned openly. The cozy atmosphere of Merriweather's seemed to sharpen, the muted lighting no longer feeling intimate but exposing. Hannah caught the sympathetic glance of a woman at the next table and quickly looked away. "I said I was sorry," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I've had a lot on my plate this week with work and the kids. It just slipped my mind." "Oh, it always slips your mind, doesn't it?" Greg shot back, leaning back in his chair with a bitter laugh. "Meanwhile, I have to be the one picking up the pieces." The waiter approached cautiously, sensing the unease. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone careful. Greg waved him off. "We're fine. Just bring the check." The waiter hesitated, but eventually nodded, retreating back into the kitchen. Hannah took a sip of water to steady herself, but Greg's words were relentless. "I don't ask for much, Hannah. I don't. But even the smallest things." He shook his head, letting the sentence hang in the air. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming about that garden and more time focusing on what actually matters, we wouldn't be in this situation. Hannah's grip tightened around her fork. Daydreaming. Was that what he thought of her efforts to make their home a warmer, more inviting space? She felt the sting of his words settle deep in her chest, but she refused to let them take root. Across the restaurant, a soft laugh rippled from another table, a group celebrating a birthday with clinking glasses and cheerful toasts. It was a cruel juxtaposition, a reminder of what this night was supposed to be. Hannah swallowed hard, her appetite long gone. "I'm sorry," she said again, though the words felt hollow now. She wasn't sure if she was apologizing for forgetting the bill or for the deeper, unspoken things Greg seemed to resent. "Can we just enjoy the rest of the evening? Please?" But Greg wasn't ready to let it go. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just brush everything under the rug with an apology? That's your problem, Hannah. You never take accountability. You're always waiting for someone else to fix things." The words hit like a slap, and this time Hannah couldn't keep the hurt from showing on her face. Her gaze dropped to her plate, her throat tightening as she fought to keep her composure. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background, replaced by the roar of her own thoughts. But before she could gather herself, Greg's voice cut through once more, and this time it carried an edge that promised things were about to escalate. It happened so fast that for a moment Hannah thought she'd imagined it. Greg, in a burst of frustration, grabbed the dessert plate between them. The slice of chocolate cake, a decadent piece she'd been looking forward to, was in his hand one second, and in the next, it was hurtling toward her. The cake hit her square in the chest, smearing dark frosting across her green dress and leaving a sticky trail down to her lap. Gasps echoed through the restaurant, loud and sharp, as every head turned toward their table. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, the laughter and clinking glasses replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. Hannah sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the mess on her dress, the sweet, rich aroma of the cake now a bitter reminder of her humiliation. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a napkin, her mind racing to process what had just happened. Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Maybe now you'll remember next time," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. There was no remorse in his voice, only the self-satisfaction of someone who thought he'd made his point. Around them, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The waiter who had been bringing the check stopped mid-step, his eyes wide with disbelief. A couple at the next table whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Even the pianist in the corner faltered, the melody stumbling as his fingers paused on the keys. Hannah felt the weight of their stares, the judgment and pity radiating from every corner of the room. But she didn't meet their eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the napkin in her hands, methodically dabbing at the frosting as if cleaning the mess could somehow erase what had just happened. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger, embarrassment, and a deep, aching sadness. She had spent years brushing off Greg's sharp words, convincing herself that his outbursts were just moments of stress or frustration. But this was different. This was public. This was deliberate. Greg, oblivious or indifferent to the gravity of what he'd done, picked up his glass of wine and took a sip, as if to punctuate his point. "Are you going to just sit there, or do something useful for once?" he said, his tone laced with disdain. The room seemed to shrink around Hannah, the walls pressing in as the weight of her humiliation threatened to overwhelm her. But somewhere beneath the hurt, a spark ignited. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper, stronger. And as she looked up, her hands stilling on the napkin, that spark began to grow, pushing her toward a decision that no one, least of all Greg, could have predicted. Hannah slowly set the napkin down on the table, her movements deliberate and calm. She raised her eyes to meet Greg's, her expression unreadable. The restaurant was so quiet now that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Every person in the room waited, breath held to see what she would do. Greg leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He thought he had won. But then Hannah stood up. Her green dress was still streaked with chocolate frosting, but she carried herself with an unexpected grace, her posture straight, her chin held high. She took a deep breath, glanced at Greg, and then turned to address the room. "I want to apologize to all of you for the scene you just witnessed," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't who I am, and it's certainly not how I live my life." The crowd stirred slightly, whispers passing between tables. Hannah's composure was captivating, her tone neither angry nor defensive, but firm and filled with a quiet strength. She turned back to Greg, her gaze steady. "For 15 years, I've tried to keep this marriage afloat. I've made excuses for your behavior, even when it hurt me. I've let your words, your anger, and now your actions chip away at my dignity." Greg's smirk began to falter, his confidence wavering under the weight of her words. "Hannah, sit down," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. She ignored him. "No, Greg," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Not this time. You crossed a line tonight, and I won't pretend it's okay anymore." The room was riveted. Servers had paused mid-task, customers leaned in closer, and even the pianist had stopped playing entirely, his hands resting motionless on the keys. Hannah reached for her purse and pulled out her wallet. She placed a few crisp bills on the table to cover the check, then looked back at Greg. "You always say I don't take accountability. Well, here's me taking accountability for staying in a situation that I should have walked away from a long time ago." The words hung in the air, heavy and powerful. Hannah picked up her coat from the back of her chair, draping it over her arm. She turned to the crowd one last time. "For anyone watching, let this be a lesson. Never let someone else define your worth. You're stronger than you think, and you deserve better than this." There was a pause, and then, to Greg's horror, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or chaotic, just a slow, deliberate clapping that started with the couple at the next table and spread like a ripple through the restaurant. Hannah didn't wait for it to swell. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the polished floor, leaving Greg sitting alone, stunned and humiliated. But as the door closed behind her, the applause continued, a quiet but resounding acknowledgement of a woman who had finally reclaimed her voice. Hannah stepped outside into the cool evening air, her heart pounding. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made the world feel sharper. The lights of the street lamps, the distant hum of traffic, the faint chatter of people passing by. She paused for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in far too long. Freedom. Inside the restaurant, Greg sat frozen at the table. The applause had faded, replaced by hushed murmurs and the occasional pointed glance in his direction. His smug demeanor had evaporated, replaced by an awkward discomfort as he realized the weight of what had just happened. The world he'd controlled so tightly for years was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Hannah didn't look back as she walked toward her car, her head held high. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it alone. Her marriage, once a cornerstone of her life, now felt like a distant chapter, a lesson learned but not one to repeat. The moral of her story wasn't just about standing up in the face of public humiliation. It was about understanding your worth, even when someone tries to strip it away. It was about realizing that the life you deserve is one built on respect, kindness, and mutual love, and that it's never too late to walk away from something that diminishes you. As Hannah drove home that night, she felt the beginnings of hope stir within her. She thought of her kids, of the garden she still wanted to plant, of the friends who had always supported her quietly from the sidelines. Life wasn't perfect, but it was hers to rebuild, and she was ready to do it on her terms. And maybe, just maybe, her story would inspire someone else, someone sitting quietly at their own dinner table, wondering if they were strong enough to demand better. Because they are. So, to anyone watching, here's a question. What would you do if someone tried to strip away your dignity? Would you stand tall, like Hannah, and reclaim your worth? Or would you let them keep you small? If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own strength and the strength of those around you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stories like Hannah's remind us that change is possible, and that every one of us has the power to write a new chapter. Because sometimes, the hardest moments in life can lead to the most beautiful transformations.